Welcome to another episode of Fly to Freedom. I ummed and ahed and thought long and hard about what to do today's episode on because it's a solo episode and there are so many different things to talk about. And while I was thinking, I thought, God, it's so hard. And then it just struck me that that was it. Recovery is so hard. Why? Why is it so hard to recover from an eating disorder? So I thought, well, I'm going to do some research into that then, and I'm going to see what I can come up with the science behind it and stuff as why it is just quite so hard to recover from an eating disorder. And whilst I am going on about how hard it is, I just want you to all please do remember that even though it's hard, it is possible and it is so worth it. Like 1,000,000%. My life is so incredibly different now. It's for the better in every single way. So even though it's hard, it's possible and it's worth it. But recovery is a tangled web of psychological, biological, and social factors. And to truly understand why recovery is so difficult, we need to look into each contributing factor and cover the neurobiological, cognitive, emotional, and social elements that make recovery such a challenging journey, and focus on practical insights and strategies. So let's look at the first bit, which is the neurobiological grip of eating disorders and the brain's role in reinforcing disordered behaviours. Eating disorders significantly alter the brain's structure and function, creating a stronghold that literally perpetuates disordered behaviours. There's been neuroimaging studies that have shown that people with anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder actually have alterations in brain regions involved in reward processing, impulse control, and self-perception. So let's look at the reward symptom dysfunction. The brain's reward system, particularly the dopaminergic pathways, play a critical role in the reinforcement of the eating disorder behaviours. For example, in anorexia, the brain may begin to associate restrictive eating with a sense of achievement or control, and then releasing dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. So this creates a really powerful reinforcement loop where you can just feel compelled to continue those restrictive behaviours despite the physical and emotional harm they cause. There is impaired decision-making and impulse control, which is from our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making and impulse control. And it functions differently in those people with eating disorders. Studies suggest that people with bulimia or binge eating disorder actually have diminished activity in this area, leading to difficulties in resisting the urge to binge or purge, even when they are aware of the negative consequences. Let's talk about the insula, which is a region of the brain involved in self-awareness and body perception. And this also shows altered activity in people with eating disorders, which can lead to a distorted body image where people genuinely see themselves as larger or smaller than they are, which reinforces unhealthy behaviours aimed at correcting these perceived flaws. And I know that certainly the entire time in the eating disorder for me and for many, many of my clients, I was convinced that I was so much bigger than I actually was. I was convinced that I was gaining weight in recovery at an incredible rate that meant that I was literally bigger than pretty much everyone else on the planet. And this is all coming from the insula, and my body perception was completely skewed. So I invite you to reflect on the ED behaviours and how do they make you feel in the moment versus how do they make you feel afterwards. So say you felt you needed to go for a really long walk because you'd had lunch. In the moment, how does that make you feel? And then afterwards, how does that make you feel? For me, in the moment, I would have felt a relief from the anxiety of having eaten, and being able to compensate would have given me a dopamine hit, would have made me feel good, would have made me feel like I was in control. And then afterwards, I'd have felt like I'd let myself down, like that I'd engaged with the eating disorder instead of with recovery, that I was failing in a sense at recovery. And so I would have a lot of emotions and thoughts that would come up. So jot down what emotions and thoughts come up for you before, during, and after engaging in these behaviours. Keep a little notebook with you or a journal. And when you start noticing these, you can start thinking about how these feelings relate to the changes in your brain's reward system. So the next point I wanted to talk about was cognitive distortion and rigid thinking patterns. So our thoughts in an eating disorder, and often in recovery when we're thinking with the voice of the eating disorder, can be really distorted, but feel incredibly powerful. Cognitive distortions are irrational, exaggerated thought patterns that play a really crucial central role in the persistence of eating disorders. These distortions can manifest as black and white thinking, overgeneralization, catastrophizing, and personalization. In black and white thinking, we often view situations in extreme terms, seeing food, body weight, and self-worth in all or nothing terms. For example, eating a so-called bad food might lead to feelings of complete failure, which reinforce the thoughts of restriction or compensation. Catastrophizing. This is another cognitive distortion that involves anticipating the worst possible outcomes. And in recovery, we will often relate this to weight gain and changes in appearance. For example, gaining even a small amount of weight might be conceived as catastrophic and lead to increased anxiety and more rigid adherence to the disordered eating behaviours. Overgeneralization. This occurs when a single negative event is seen as a never-ending pattern of defeat. For example, if you slip up and eat a forbidden food, that means you might make this mean that you've failed entirely, which leads to more and more disordered eating and restriction as a coping mechanism. Personalization. This involves taking the blame for events outside of your control. Like, say a friend of yours has fallen over on their way to the shops, and you would say, well, if I hadn't wanted the biscuits, this would never have happened. This is all my fault. Or it could be believing that other people are scrutinizing your eating habits or appearance, which increases anxiety around food and social situations, which further entrenches the ED. So it's time to grab your journal again. So I've got some more questions. Can you identify any common cognitive distortions that you experience? Write them down and then challenge each one by asking, is this thought based on facts? What evidence do I have that supports or contradicts this thought? How would I advise a friend who had this same thought? So the next point I want to talk about is actually malnutrition, because it's a critical factor in the persistence of eating disorders and has huge effects on our mental health. So when your body is deprived of essential nutrients, it seriously affects your brain function, emotional regulation, and your overall mental well-being. There's cognitive impairment because your brain requires a steady supply of nutrients to function optimally. Malnutrition, particularly in severe cases of restriction, leads to cognitive deficits, including difficulties with concentration, memory, and decision-making. These impairments make it challenging to engage effectively in therapy or make the healthy decisions necessary for recovery. Because you literally can't think straight when you are really malnourished. Therapies and coaching and everything is really, really hard. It's the actions of eating that have to come first. And then when your brain is less malnourished, everything else comes in and you can think about it, you can actually take it in better. Whereas when you're really, really in severe restriction, it's actually impossible to take everything in. There's emotional dysregulation when you're malnourished. The nutrient deficiencies, especially with essential fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals, can disrupt the production of neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine, which are really, really important for your mood regulation. This disruption leads to hugely increased anxiety, depression, and irritability, all of which can reinforce the cycle of disordered eating as you seek to manage these overwhelming emotions. There are also physical complications. The physical effects of malnutrition, such as extreme fatigue, dizziness, and muscle weakness, also create barriers to recovery. When you're physically depleted, it's really difficult to find the energy or motivation to engage in the rigorous process of recovery. So the next questions for journaling is for you to reflect on how your current eating patterns might be affecting your physical and mental health. How do you feel mentally and emotionally on days when you nourish your body versus on days when you don't? And what small steps can you take and will you take to start nourishing your body more consistently? And when you think about this, it's commonly known that people get hangry when they're over hungry, when they've waited too long. So if you imagine that, that's just from having lunch late or something. So imagine how it is in your brain when you're really restricting. It's just magnified by so much. It's no wonder we feel so anxious and just so unstable, really. And then the next point I want to talk about, which is really, really important actually, and seems to be the one that almost everybody is afraid of, is the body image, how we see ourselves. So there's the complexity of body image disturbance. Body image disturbance is not just dissatisfaction with how you see yourself, but a deeply ingrained and often distorted perception of your body. This distortion is central to the development and maintenance of eating disorders. So there's perceptual distortion, Many people with eating disorders genuinely perceive their bodies differently from how they actually appear. This is not simply a matter of feeling fat, but actually involves a significant misperception that can be resistant to change. Neuroimaging studies suggest that alterations in brain regions responsible for body perception, such as the insula, contribute to this distortion. And then there's emotional distress. So body image disturbance is often accompanied by intense emotional distress. Your self-worth becomes closely tied to your body shape or size, which leads to severe anxiety and depression when you see yourself as not meeting your own or society's standards. This emotional turmoil can drive disordered eating behaviours as a misguided attempt to manage or alleviate these negative feelings. And then for many people, their body image becomes intertwined with their identity. They may see their self-control over food or weight as a defining feature of who they are. I certainly did. I was the thin one, the fit one, the one that was on the go all the time. And letting go of this identity can be really terrifying, which makes it really hard to embrace recovery, because that often involves changes in weight and body shape. So how does your perception of your body affect your self-esteem and daily life? Write about how you feel when you look in the mirror versus how you feel when you focus on other aspects of yourself, such as your talents, relationships, or achievements. What might change in how you feel if you started to define yourself by the other aspects of yourself instead of by your body? The pervasive impact of diet culture, I mean, it's everywhere. We can't get away from it. It's constant, and it plays a significant role in both the development and persistence of eating disorders. Diet culture in particular glorifies thinness and promotes restrictive eating patterns, making it difficult to recover. So what is diet culture? It's a system of beliefs that equates thinness with health, morality, and success, while stigmatizing fatness and promoting weight loss as a way to achieve these ideals. This culture is pervasive in media advertising and even healthcare, reinforcing disordered eating behaviors and body dissatisfaction. Social media platforms can often amplify diet culture by constantly exposing people to images of idealized bodies and promoting unhealthy diet trends. The curated nature of social media can create unrealistic expectations and increase body dissatisfaction, especially in vulnerable people. A stigma and shame. Society often stigmatizes those who do not conform to its beauty standards, leading to a feeling of shame and isolation. For someone with an eating disorder, this external pressure can reinforce internal beliefs about the need to control their body through disordered eating behaviors. What messages have you internalized from society about body image and your diet? Have they influenced your relationship with food and your body? Can you think of a time where you felt pressured by societal standards? How did it affect you? What can you do to challenge these pressures? Fear of weight gain and loss of control. The deep-seated fear of losing control. The fear of weight gain is a significant barrier to recovery for many people with eating disorders. This fear is not just about your body size, but often represents a deeper fear of losing control over your life. Controlling your food intake and weight may become a way to assert control in a life that may feel really quite chaotic or unpredictable. And this sense of control, and I say sense because it is not a real control, but it can provide temporary relief from anxiety. And it makes it really difficult to give that up, even when it causes harm. This fear of the unknown. Recovery often involves weight restoration on changes in eating habits, which can trigger intense fear of the unknown. You may fear that gaining weight will lead to negative judgments from others, loss of self-worth, or a return to feeling out of control. Perfectionism is another common trait amongst those with eating disorders. The desire to have an idealized body or to adhere perfectly to dietary rules can make the thought of weight gain feel like a personal failure, reinforcing the need to maintain strict control over eating. So, what does control mean to you in your life? How do you use food or your body to feel in control? Write about a time when you felt out of control. What happened and how did you cope? How can you begin to develop a healthier relationship with control that doesn't involve food or your body? As I don't think I've ever met anybody that hasn't had some form of comorbidity with other mental health disorders who is living certainly in a restrictive eating disorder. And there's a really complex interplay of co-occurring disorders with eating disorders, such as anxiety disorders, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. These comorbid conditions can complicate recovery and often require integrated treatment approaches. Anxiety disorders are really common in people with eating disorders. The anxiety may manifest as a fear of food, weight gain, or loss of control, and can drive disordered eating behaviours as a way to cope with these fears. Addressing the underlying anxiety is really important, but can be challenging when the eating disorder behaviours are deeply ingrained. Depression often coexists with eating disorders as well, creating a vicious cycle. Low mood and lack of motivation can make it difficult to engage in recovery behaviours, whilst malnutrition and the stress of an eating disorder can exacerbate depressive symptoms. OCD. Many people with eating disorders, particularly in restrictive eating disorders, exhibit OCD behaviours related to food, eating, and body image. These behaviours can be difficult to address because they're often reinforced by the eating disorder itself. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. For some people, eating disorders develop as a way to cope with trauma. They are quite literally a coping mechanism. The eating disorder may provide a sense of control or a way to numb emotional pain. Treating the underlying trauma is really essential for recovery and can be a long and difficult process. And a lot of people are frightened to start facing this. Okay, I'm back. I thought they would stop barking, but they didn't. It was getting more and more and more. So I've just been in and closed the blinds and asked them very politely to be quiet and go to sleep. So hopefully they will, because they weren't even barking at anything. It was just a whole lot of noise. So journal prompts on this are: reflect on the relationship between your eating disorder and any other mental health struggles you experience. How do they interact with each other? Think about how addressing one might help alleviate the other. on what are some steps you can take to begin addressing both your eating disorder and your mental health. Ambivalence towards recovery. The inner conflict of wanting to recover but fearing change. Ambivalence is a common experience in eating disorder recovery. It involves the simultaneous desire to recover and the fear of letting go of the eating disorder, which can create significant internal conflict. There's the fear of losing identity. For some people, many people, their eating disorder becomes a core part of their identity. They may fear that without it, they will lose a sense of who they are and what makes them special. I literally didn't know who I was going to be without an eating disorder. I had no idea who I was at all. And this fear can create resistance to recovery, even when you know that the eating disorder is harmful. There's ambivalence about change because recovery requires change, and change is always inherently uncomfortable. The eating disorder may have served as a coping mechanism for years, and it feels like it provides a sense of stability or control. And the prospect of giving up familiar behaviours can be frightening, which can lead to ambivalence about the recovery process. Mixed feelings about recovery. It's really common for people to have mixed feelings about recovery. You might want to get better, but also fear the changes recovery will bring, such as weight gain, that feeling of a loss of control, or facing difficult emotions without the eating disorder as a crutch. So write down your feelings towards recovery. What do you hope to gain from recovery? And what do you fear losing? Reflect on how your eating disorder has served you in the past, because it will have served you for sure. And do those benefits still hold true to you today? What would it mean for you to fully recover? This long-term nature of recovery, it can feel like a never-ending challenge to sustain recovery over time. Because recovery from an eating disorder is often a long-term process, and it requires sustained effort, patience, and resilience. The journey is pretty much never linear. There's always going to be setbacks, possibly relapses along the way. It's always up and down. Setbacks can be disheartening, leading you to question your progress, or maybe you feel like you're failing. But they are a natural part of the process and can provide incredibly valuable learning opportunities if you can reframe them and look at what you can take from them, what you can learn from them. It can be really, really helpful to your recovery. Maintaining motivation over the long term can also be challenging, especially when your progress feels like it's slow or old habits resurface. So maintaining motivation requires regular self-reflection, setting realistic goals, and finding sources of inspiration and support. Relapse can be common in eating disorder recovery, but it doesn't mean failure. Understanding that relapse can be a part of the recovery process can help you approach it with compassion and use it as an opportunity to strengthen your recovery. Excuse me. So reflect on a time when you faced a long-term challenge in your life. How did you stay motivated? And what did you learn from that experience? How can these lessons be applied to your recovery journey? What strategies can you use to maintain motivation and resilience even during setbacks? The impact of relational dynamics. So relationships can support or hinder recovery. And relationships with family, friends, partners play a really important role in recovery. And they can either provide support and encouragement or create additional challenges. Family relationships, family dynamics can be particularly influential in recovery. Family members may unintentionally reinforce disordered behaviours or struggle to understand the complexity of the disorder because, let's face it, logically, an eating disorder makes no logical sense. It doesn't mean it's not real. It doesn't mean the feelings aren't there. It doesn't mean the fears aren't there. But if you're not in it and you've never been in it, it makes no logical sense to be afraid of food at all. So family-based therapy can often be very effective in involving family members in the recovery process and looking at any dysfunctional dynamics in the family relationships. Positive, supportive relationships can provide the emotional support needed to navigate the challenges of recovery. Now, these can be with partners, parents, friends, or an eating disorder professional like a coach, a therapist. These relationships can offer encouragement, understanding, and accountability, which helps you stay on track with your recovery goals. And there's harmful relationships that can be people that are critical, judgmental, or dismissive to you can really harm your recovery. You can feel unsupported or pressured, which leads to increased stress and a reliance on disordered behaviours as a coping mechanism. So reflect on the role your relationships play in your recovery. Who are the people in your life who support your recovery? And how do they show that support? Are there any relationships that may be hindering your progress? What can you do to strengthen supportive relationships and to set boundaries with those that are less helpful? So in conclusion, recovery is really hard because it's a complex and challenging process, and it's influenced by a wide range of neurobiological, cognitive, emotional, social, and relational factors. When we look at them in greater depth, you can approach your journey with more insight, compassion, and effective strategies. Now, just like all the journaling prompts I've given you through this episode, journaling is an incredibly powerful tool in this journey because it helps you explore your thoughts and feelings, identify patterns, and track your progress over time. Recovery is possible. It really, really is. With the right support, and do feel free to reach out to me. I have 2 spaces, I think, on my one-to-one coaching at the moment. But you really can achieve lasting freedom from the eating disorder. So even though recovery is hard, and it is the hardest journey I've ever done in my life, but it's also the journey that's been the most rewarding. I've learned the most about myself. I've tapped into my own self-love, peace, contentment, what I need, what lights me up, what I don't need, what I can let go of. And I've literally learned so much about myself in the recovery process. It is very much recovery and discovery. And it's, even though, as I said, it is the hardest journey I've ever done, it is the most worthwhile and the most rewarding And I would honestly say, please don't give up. This is a journey to a future of true freedom and happiness and discovery, self-discovery. You can do it. I totally believe in you. Keep going. You've got this. Lots of love.